And then David Rennie from the Economist.
Well, I guess I have the advantage of being the sort of professional hack on this panel. How to put this without sounding too extreme? Look, and I used to work for the Daily Telegraph as well, as a Brussels correspondent. I think that British press coverage of the EU is of course linked to the force of the EU in its own way, but it's a disgrace. I think that the British press is sick at the heart. I think that there's a lot of things that are very seriously wrong with British newspapers. I think that the EU is one of the worst possible examples of that. I think you need to understand, it's not that journalists innocently don't understand the European Union. You need to understand that the blood that courses through the veins of newspaper journalists is cynicism. Is cynicism and laziness and the desire to fill tomorrow's news pages with something that will get them a good show. And the EU has fulfilled the role now. I don't know if you remember, sort of in the 80s, all films had to have sort of baddies, and there was a while when the baddies were Palestinians, then that became kind of bad. So they had to be aliens at one point, because we couldn't sort of pick on anyone else. The EU fulfills that role for British newspapers. It is the thing that you give a kicking to, because it doesn't sue. If it complains, who cares? I mean, why do British journalists watch what they write about anyone or anything? Because they might get sued, or because the person they're writing about might be able to put a call into their editor and make trouble for them. But basically, if you have an institution that is basically unpopular, for some reasons which may be sound, and which you know will not sue, doesn't complain, and if they do complain, what, a letter from the European Commission comes to your editor, gets pinned on the notice board, it's sort of badge of honour, look, some wanker from the Commission's complaint, ha ha ha. I mean, I'll give you one small example, because I do have to run, I'm really sorry about this, I'll give you an example from recent times. There was a story in the papers over the summer about the European Union had fined Britain £100 million for failing to put the EU flag over EU-funded projects. This ran in the Mail, it ran lots of places. And I saw that story and I thought to myself, 100 million, it just sounds nuts. How can you get £100 million fine for flags? That just sounds crap. So I put some calls in. It took a lot of calls because the Commission is also extremely bad at saying that stories are not true, because it's a very big machine, the Commission is cautious, there's lots of bits of it, they very rarely want to say something's completely untrue. It turned out that this story basically was fed to the Daily Mail by Eric Pickles' special advisors, because it was a good Eurosceptic story, it was going to get them some coverage. Eric Pickles was quoted in the story. The story is in fact that there are, to my mind, rather ridiculous rules that if you take money from the EU structural funds, you have to have a certain size of the European flag, you have to fly the flag. Well, but I'm going to have to leave immediately after this, so I might just finish this. I'm sorry, I've got a childcare crisis, I had to run. But, so the rules are that you have to have these flags. In theory, if you don't obey these rules, you can have that portion of your funding withheld from you. What had happened is an internal exercise within the British government. They had calculated the maximum possible costs that could one day be clawed back if the Commission were ever to levy a fine. And they come up with a figure which I think is like £150,000, I think. That's the actual figure. And the Commission has only once in history ever actually fined someone for this, and it was Greece over the Venizelos airport at Athens. But the figure of 100 million was completely invented. Completely invented. It's just not true. It hasn't been fined, it never will be fined. It's complete cobblers. But it was a very happy conspiracy between the British government, which had an idea for a nice cute story, and a press which does not give a stuff. It just doesn't. And I cannot tell you that the British press, they simply, it's about what will make a story tomorrow. It's what will make a show. And the EU, for all its manifold faults, is the perfect victim because it doesn't sue and it doesn't complain and everyone dislikes it. So it's the fat kid in the playground with glasses that gets beaten up every break time. Why does it get beaten up every break time? Because it just does. That's its job, to get beaten up.
Right, thank you. From now on, I'll keep to the 2 minutes, but strictly, I'm afraid. So, you all agree that the EU is complex, and some said that the EU is quite boring. Should the readers be interested? Is there a way of making it more interesting, more simpler? Guido, do we start?
Well, to make it more interesting, you have to do all the things that you just complained about. You have to sex up the story in a sense to make it entertaining and make it attractive for people to read. Otherwise, it's just dull, going on about subsidy regimes or whatever. And that's how you sell papers, so you can't really change that.
Well, yeah. The trouble with the EU in particular is there aren't personalities. What sells newspapers is personalities. I mean, we all know about the whole celebrity obsession thing, and when it comes to politics, you need somebody like Boris Johnson figure to line things up a bit. Because otherwise, who cares? It's just boring. And what does the EU do? They go and get Herman and it's just like, what the hell? You're picking the most boring man in the whole of Europe, who no one's ever heard of, and he's your frontman. It's just like, what the hell are you thinking? You want it? I mean, Tony Blair would have been a bloody disaster, but at least people know who he is. And it's the trouble, there's nobody famous. The EU is where people go to basically end their political careers and then supposedly pick up a massive pension, which probably does happen actually. And until you get somebody interesting with a bit of personality as some kind of spokesman for some part of the EU, you're never going to get any press coverage, because you're just going to get EU Commission spokesperson says such and such and quoted in paragraph 19. And it's just not interesting. So yeah, I mean, you can sex it up with made-up stories, but made-up positive stories are never going to happen, because positive stories aren't news. So, bad news sells, personality sells. We've got plenty of bad news from the EU, but we haven't got any personalities.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And in addition, I would like to add that it's very difficult to deal with this sort of through the communication channels alone, because the EU also deals with regulatory issues. I mean, it has some spending powers, which I'm sure we've heard about from the British media, from somewhere else. It has an EU budget, so it has a small budget, but its main powers are regulatory. Regulation is boring, as you rightly point out. It's extremely boring. It's important though, because it impacts a lot of people, but it's very, very boring. And I think one way of solving it would simply be for the EU to do less and do it better. Then it will be a lot easier to communicate to people what the EU actually is about and what it's supposed to do and what it does and will have a positive impact on your life. At the moment, it's all over the place, which makes it very difficult to communicate.
David?
No, I think that's true. I mean, in Brussels, where I was seen as a kind of raving Eurosceptic, I suppose here I'm seen as a raving Europhile. in Brussels, I was hoping, actually you should calm down and worry less about why you don't get more coverage. Because if you think of what makes political coverage in the UK, it's the kind of pocketbook issues like schools and hospitals and should you send troops to war. Well, the EU doesn't do schools and hospitals and sending troops to war. It's basically a very powerful regulator in things like trade policy, competition policy, environmental regulation. If you think about it, how often does the Competition Commission end up on the front page of British newspapers here? I mean, our own domestic regulators don't end up making news very often. So, the EU comes under the heading of important but dull quite a lot of the time. I don't have a problem with that if it means it doesn't get covered very much. My problem is that the industry that I think is very serious and very important, because it's one way of people knowing what to vote in elections. I think that it brings out everything that is bad and everything that is worst about the way the British newspapers work.